Hey up and welcome to the Strategy Sessions. My name is Andy Jarvis. I am the host of the show and the founder of Eximo Marketing, a strategy consultancy based in Belfast and Liverpool. If you're here to listen to JP Castlin, thank you for coming along. JP's interview is along shortly. An interview I really enjoyed doing. If you don't know how this podcast is planned, I agree themes with the guests. We don't script questions. It's not one of those like Nick Clegg's interview with Mark Zuckerberg, where he is woodenly reading all the questions off the auto cue behind the camera. We just agree themes. We'll talk about A, B, C, X, Y, Z, and then we just launch into it. The discussion goes where the discussion goes. We dive in when we say things that we disagree on, and we expand when there's things that we like. That's just how it works. And today's episode is probably the best example of that, where the conversation dips into all sorts of areas that you probably never expect, but all in a really interesting and in-depth way. If you've not heard JP before, he's a great thinker. You'll start to get an idea of where his mind goes, and it's really fascinating to listen. So please just hang on for 30 seconds and we'll get you into that episode. Before we do, I suppose the big marketing story of the last week or so has been Facebook's rebrand to Meta. Literally nobody has asked my opinion of that so far. I'll give you a very short thought on it. I don't really care. No one's going to forget what the company's been involved in the next couple of years because they've changed the name from Facebook to Meta. The app's still going to be called Meta. It feels more like a corporate thing that probably needed doing anyway, as opposed to some sort of Machiavellian plan to make people go, those Facebook guys used to be horrible, but now they're called Meta. They're lovely. It's just not the case, right? So yeah, that's my very quick take on it. If you are interested in Facebook, a couple of months ago, I had Facebook's director of agencies, a guy called Nick Bourne, come on the show, and we chatted about regulation, about Facebook for agencies and how people contact them and some of the issues around that. Nick, really great open character. We had a good discussion there. Please do dive into the back catalogue and have a listen there. And if you're bored, if you're interested, it's also, as I'm recording this, it's Halloween, which also in the UK makes it the last day of Black History Month. So you might also want to check out Luke Carthy's podcast with me, where we talked about Black Friday. Luke is one of my favourite humans, and we had a fantastic discussion. Look, you're a bit late if you're still doing your Black Friday planning, unfortunately, but it's a great episode anyway, so dive in and have a listen to that. Enough promoting the old episodes. Let's just get into the next episode. JP joined me from his kitchen. We had an interesting discussion about his grinders on Twitter, so if you're watching the video on YouTube, have a look behind him and try and work out what's in all the different salt and pepper mills. But anyway, that's not what you're here for. Let's have a listen to the episode. JP, here we go. Let's dive in. JP, thank you for joining me on the Strategy Sessions. How are you today?
My pleasure, Andy. I'm great. How are you?
Top of the world, thank you. I've been recording a couple of podcasts for this season with some of my favorite strategists who I have met, I say that loosely, via social media. And you are one of the people who, when I see your tweets pop up, I'm like, oh, great, I'm going to have a read of this. See JP writing in Marketing Week, I'm thinking, I'm going to have a read of this as well. So it's an absolute honor to have you on the show. Thank you for your time.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Honor to be on the show as well, I must say.
Great stuff, great stuff. Well, look, let's start with an easy question. Dead simple. Let's get started. How do you define strategy to your clients and in your business?
To my clients, I tend to define strategy as kind of a guiding principle or strategic intent that kind of evolves over time, but it allows us a bit to predict in what way it's going to evolve. And that's a bit of a shit definition, but broadly speaking, the problem that I have with strategy in most definitions of strategy is that it tends to end up being just a plan, right? It's not entirely true. If you look at sort of how people tend to define strategy, if we're looking at it more broadly, not just marketing, but more broadly, it tends to be one of four things. So it's either sort of a plan, right? Sort of a means of getting from here to there. It can be a pattern and actions taken over time. So you'll find someone like Mintzberg or sort of the agile people over here typically. It can be a position that reflects decisions to offer certain products, certain segments and so on. This is like the Porter camp. And then it can be a perspective, which is kind of like a vision and direction, which is probably where you'll find someone like me. But what is interesting about these definitions is that if you look at them sort of collectively as opposed to individually, they are almost mutually exclusive. So plan is sort of the outcome of direct control and deliberateness, and we're going to do this, this, that, and before the event. Whereas a pattern and actions taken over time is sort of the result of indirect control and emergence. You can only observe that after the fact. A position is where you are, right? Whereas a direction is indicative of where you want to be, and therefore can, per definition, cannot be, right? So you have all these various definitions of strategy, and so what it ends up being, to my original point, is therefore a kind of like this original idea of, concept of business, of what we are about, how we're going to win, or whatever you want to call it, that kind of evolves over time, depending on the context. And so it's more of a, when I work with clients on strategy, it becomes more of a framework, I suppose, that guides sort of subsequent actions, as opposed to the traditional, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and the strategic sort of planning, and what I call programming, if that makes sense.
No, so so loads of stuff to unpick there, and the different definitions are really important. And I know when I start most engagement with clients, one of the things I do is spend some time defining terminology. Not a huge amount of time.
Yeah.
But just so, you go into the room, you've maybe worked in my situation, maybe with the CEO or the sort of marketing director, somebody like that, that brought me in. And we've talked in the run up to this, and they know exactly what I'm going to do. Then the CFO might come in the room, or some of the other people come in the room, and what they think marketing strategy is going to be, can often be quite different to what we're actually going to do. So I spent some time defining. Now, to me, and sort of strategy, tactics, and plan are kind of the three things that I try and define for them. And I always say strategy is where we're going. Tactics is how we're going to get there. And then the marketing plan, which will be a deliverable maybe at the end of this, is the strategy, the tactics, a calendar, and a budget. Wrap all those things together, and you've got a marketing plan. I think from your description of where you are, that puts me probably in a little bit more of the deliberate camp. Of strategists, as opposed to you were sort of more in the vision, I think you said.
Well, yes. I mean, you can say that. First of all, I think you're absolutely correct in trying to define the language internally, because that's I wrote about this for Marketing Week a couple of weeks ago. But it's one thing that marketers often miss, is exactly to your point, is that we kind of presume that everyone means the same thing. And what really matters is that we all mean the same thing, at least internally within that team or department or company, regardless of what the sort of supposed thought leaders actually say something is, right? What actually matters is what we mean, and then of course we can hold agencies accountable to that definition, which is really, really helpful. But I mean, where I tend to end up in my strategy work, and it should probably be clarified as well, is that I don't do a lot of marketing strategy these days. I do global marketing strategy for clients, but I don't do a lot of the traditional sort of 1-year plan kind of stuff. I do more business strategic stuff. And the way that I sort of describe, I suppose, is to have a centralized intent and then decentralized execution. So in a marketing plan, traditionally, what you would do is exactly to your point, is that you'll sort of define the strategy, the tactics, we're going to do this, I'm going to do this, and then usually you tie a budget on top of it. So you work on a sort of annual basis. Whereas I would go, okay, so this is broadly speaking what we're trying to achieve, then I'm going to allow you to sort of get to that point however you like, provided that it is sort of coherent to the overall direction of the organization. Now, I'm going to hold you accountable to it. There are various ways of doing that, of course. But it's kind of like, I suppose, I was going to say freedom on some sort of form of control. It's not true. But I'm going to sort of allow people and trust people, I suppose, to do what they're asked to do. And granted, there is a problem in this occasionally in practice, because it presumes that people know what they're doing, which is not necessarily true that all the time that they do. However, you could definitely say that the same would be true for management, because one of the problems with the traditional way of doing strategy is that it becomes almost paternalistic, in the sense that management knows best, right? We're going to tell you what to do, and then you can do it, come from hell or high water. And the problem is that a lot of the time is that although employees can sort of fail to see the forest for the trees, management and leadership often fail to see the trees for the forest, if that makes sense. So again, you need to sort of combine that, and it ties into a whole thing, which I'm currently calling naturalized strategy making, but that's a different thing.
No, I like that. 'Cause I've recently done a presentation at Brighton SEO, so search engine optimization conference, where there's a lot of people doing talks about search strategies and things like that. And
Yep.
I didn't actually go in person. I got COVID, but they still
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I saw
pushed me
that
out
on
on the.
Twitter. Yeah.
I'm heartbroken by it. Heartbroken. But they still pushed me out on the digital version, which was fine. And I had kind of this waterfall approach to strategy,
Mm.
and I almost, I'm not saying this is what search marketers or any tactical marketers get wrong, but I'm saying you've got to have an appreciation of what the business strategy is, which is
Yes.
often 3, 5, 7, 9, or 10 years in horizon. I don't know why it's never 2, 4, 6, or 8, but maybe you could shed some light on that. And then on the
Yeah.
marketing
I'll
strategy
get back.
spins out of that in year-long increments, and then you have your search or your content or social or whatever strategies come, but they all sort of have to cascade and waterfall from one to another. And people sort of look at me and send me messages afterwards, and they're a bit like, I never really realized that. You're like, well, how can you come up with a content strategy if you don't know what the
Yeah.
overall business is trying to achieve and where you're trying to go?
Yes.
It seems really obvious to me, but maybe.
No, you're absolutely right. And so how we've described it in the past, myself and a former colleague called Gary Forrest, is the strategic hierarchy, which is kind of like a scaffolding, I suppose, in the sense that it kind of it creates the structure upon which you can sort of hang all your other strategies. And exactly to your point, what tends to happen is you have the business or corporate strategy on top, then you move down layer from layer to layer to layer to layer, and then all the way down to, I would say, perhaps, campaign strategy or SEO strategy, whatever it might be. And so your job, whenever you're sitting, or rather wherever you're sitting on this hierarchy, is to kind of know the strategy above you and being able to for the strategy below you, because that kind of creates, I hate to use the term alignment because I'm not a fan of alignment, but coherence, let's say, in the organization. And exactly to your point, I mean, the fact is that what you're doing on a ground level is trying to sort of move towards that greater ambition of the organization. Now, the problem I have with the time horizons is that all companies act on this sort of time continuum between inception and demise, right? So when we say 3 years or 5 years, we kind of assume that that's a magical, idealized future state where all our problems have been solved. That never happens. The company goes on, unless you're talking about bankruptcy or selling the company or whatever. And that's one of my sort of perpetual points about how I do strategy, is to not think in terms of we're going to do this and that and this, because that never happens in practice, right? And there are a couple of reasons why. One of them has to do with the fact that you literally cannot predict what's going to happen. It's not that we don't have enough data. Within the complex adaptive system, you literally cannot do it. And I can explain why. But the other thing is that if you work a day of practice, or in practice with strategy, what happens? We collect the data, we do the diagnostics, right? We try to learn as much as we can about the system and the market and the company, yada, yada, yada. And then, of course, during this planning process, we kind of assume that the time sort of stops, because, of course, now we're doing the planning process. But anyway, so we do that, and then we go, okay, so we did that. What happens day 2? Every time, what happens basically day 2? Well, something we hadn't thought of, right? An executive leaves, or a competitor does something, and this, that, and the other. And so either we sort of go, oh, fuck it, we're just going to go with the strategy anyway, or we go, oh shit, we need to do something. So we have to do this entire thing over and over and over again. That's great if you're a consultant like me, by the way, because you can sort of dip it back into your client pool. But it's not necessarily in the interest of the company. And so being able to adapt sort of on the fly is quite useful. The problem is that it often tends. Did you see Coca-Cola's recent sort of agency audit? It's been in the press lately.
I don't know that I have, No.
So Coca-Cola are doing this big agency audit, right? So they've spent 9 months with hundreds and hundreds of meetings, like bragging about how slow this process has been, to come up with this idea of we need an agency that can do agile and move fast. And just go. So you spent 9 months to come up with this idea. Oh, we need to move quickly, and just go. And that's the thing. Like, you need to. The problem with planning is that you kind of assume that everything stops, and then go, oh, we need to move fast now. And what you really need to do in strategy is you need to create the ability to move fast when you have to. That's kind of thing. You don't need to move fast all the time. You can't be slow all the time. You have to adapt, and that becomes not an essence of strategy, but it becomes an important part of strategy. And the problem when we have these 3, 5, 7, whatever, is that we kind of build in this sort of inertia in the system. Yes, you need a strategic ambition, you need some sort of shared understanding of success, but going in the 7 years we're going to be here has a tendency of creating a floor as much as a ceiling. And again, I think one of the key traits of a good strategist is kind of being humble and open to changing things and learning on the fly. And anyway.
Yeah, I look at continuum. I talked about a continuum before between kind of intuitive strategy, which was trying to put a nice word around making it up as you go along, and the very deliberate strategy that was sort of, you might read about kind of General Motors in the 30s or whatever, that type of, 5-year plan, and we will move X to Y and all that sort of stuff. And somewhere in the middle of that continuum, I refer to it as emergent strategy, where I tend to, if you were to draw that continuum, I tend to be 2/3 of the way along towards deliberate, where you plan as much as you can. Say, accept that stuff's going to change, right? And nobody sees that coming, so you have to be nimble enough to stay on your feet and move it. It is a different frame of mind, isn't it? Because I think a lot of executives and MBA students and people you deal with are just used to this. We have day 1 to day 990 or whatever it is, and that's the window that we operate in, and then I'll move job and go somewhere else, and this thing will keep going. So
yes, you're absolutely right. So when I wrote Strategy and Polemy, which is my latest, I suppose, ebook, I talked about this balance of obligation and optionality between deliberate and emergence. Exactly your point, deliberate here being the traditional strategic planning, we're going to do this, that, and the other, whereas emergent is kind of learning on the fly, and I suppose you could call it agile to a degree. And you're absolutely right. I mean, strategy and practice has to be this balance between the two. If you're working in an industry that's highly mature, has high barriers to entry, and hasn't changed in the last 150, 200 years, like, ball bearings or gravel or something, then the odds of something happening overnight they're quite low, right? Or quite poor. And the reason why, of course, is because you're looking at, again, a very mature market, but also your products are probably ingrained in your customer system, so therefore you can't change overnight because there are lag effects and so on. You can do a lot of strategic planning in that, right? There's no point going all in on agile, that would be stupid. But if you're working in a category such as, say, fintech, where things almost literally change, on a week by week basis, trying to define where you're going to be in a year, 2 years, or 5 years from now is just stupid, because you have no idea, no way of knowing. So you get to that balance of, again, optionality and obligation. And one of my sort of pet peeves with strategy and strategy discourse and the way the strategy is taught is that it becomes very binary. It's just like, we're going to do only agile, or we're going to do only this, or only that, or the other. In practice, it's never one of the two. It's always a mix. And how you mix that depends on context. It's one of those things about complexity, is that in complexity, nothing is context general, everything is context specific, and context keeps changing. And so we need to be able to sort of adapt, but of course, as well, create that stability along the way. So yeah, I completely agree with you. That's the way that I approach strategy too.
So you mentioned the ebook that you've written, and you've put, there's a couple, isn't there, that you've put together?
So
tell us about your books.
Yeah, so if you can trace it back to the company that I was CEO for 7 years, a consultancy called Rouser. Me and Gary created this thing called the Rouser Manifesto, which is like, it was more an exercise in writing for ourselves, just to challenge ourselves, and then we published it, and over the years it became quite popular because we did one every year. And then that became, now that I'm an independent consultant, this thing called Strategy and Polemy, which started out as the Castlin Manifesto. But so that's the one thing. And then at the moment I'm writing this new book, which we haven't really decided on the name yet, but it's basically going to introduce my new framework of doing strategy. And it comes out of, I mentioned this thing, it's an expression that I just thought of the other day, but I kind of like it. It's this thing called naturalized strategy making. And what I mean by that, it basically, it takes strategy, but then it also sort of builds in natural sciences. So things like complexity theory, complexity science, psychology, and whatever it might be. But basically, it takes a scientific look at strategy. and not necessarily theoretic sort of scientific, but actually sort of what works in practice. And the problem, exactly to your previous point about the MBA programs, is that we have this quite outdated view of a strategy is this idea of sort of the organization being almost mechanistic, and all the employees are cogs. I mean, if you remove this, we can put that thing there, and so on. And you can actually trace it. I mean, you can trace it all the way back to, well, I managed to late 1700s. And I can tell you the entire story if you're interested. But basically, the point is that the way we do strategy at the moment is based on national economics and macroeconomics from the 1700s, and also a bit of physics thrown in for good measure. And it's not how a sort of a modern market or modern company works. So my attempt of sort of not solving this, but maybe helping people, is just kind of take what we know, the updates and the findings in science and so on, and then bring it into strategy to create this sort of more pragmatic way of working. So that's the new book, which should come out hopefully maybe next year.
Excellent. Oh, brilliant. Yeah. As somebody who's been trying to write a book on strategy for the last 4 years, and I'm still no more than about 50 or 60% of the way through it. I am absolutely in awe of people who start writing books and finish them as well.
The latter part there is, I think, is the big one. I've started it, and then we'll know. Who knows whether I'll be able to finish it, because that's the thing as well. Like, my wife and I have our first child coming in November. So having the deadline of the book and having a child coming is going to be an interesting one. But then I got a nice piece of framing from, Rob Campbell?
Not personally, but I know.
Yeah, but So I had a Zoom call with him a couple of months ago, and we were talking about this, and he said, well, he had a friend apparently who she had been trying to get pregnant for 10 years through IVF, right? And they'll test tube babies, in sort of more common language, I suppose. But anyway, and so for 10 years, she'd been trying to get pregnant. And I mean, imagine the sort of mental and physical and financial toll that this must have taken. She eventually got pregnant with the triplets. She got 3 kids. And just after she'd had the triplets, she got pregnant for the first time in her life naturally, and got another pair of twins. So they have 5 kids under 2 years old, right? And he just went, so one child is probably not going to be that bad. And I just went, no, actually, that's a fair point. Yeah.
It's an interesting point, and God bless anyone with 5 children under the age of 2.
Yeah,
just 5 children generally. I'm one of 4 boys, and I remember when I moved out to university when I was 18. I'm the youngest as well. It took me about 3 or 4 months to work out what was wrong, what I thought was wrong with me. And it was the fact that I lived in a house. I moved into a university house, and there was 3 of us, all doing different courses. So I was often in the house on my own. And it took me about 3 months to realize I'd never really been in the house on my own, because you had 4 boys and my mum, so 5 of us living in a 3-bedroomed house for my entire life. So the house was never empty, and there was always friends around and people around. So it was just this noisy chaos. So anyone
that brings up a really interesting point. So 2 things. Firstly, could you concentrate when you were alone?
No, I still it took me probably 10 years to be able to work in silence.
Exactly, right? Yeah. So that's the thing. From my experience as well, I only have the one brother, but from friends who've sort of been raised in sort of families with more children, that they have real problems trying to sort of concentrate on, when they're silent and when they're alone. For example, when they took tests in school. But what it also brings up is a really interesting point about the office and working from home. Because if you're one of those people who can't concentrate if you're alone, but your company shuts down the office because it's more efficient that people, work from home, then all of a sudden you might actually have problems producing the work that you should do. Like, it's a really interesting thing.
Yeah, I find it easier now, obviously consulting, spending, I look forward to the times when I'm in the room and it's quiet and I'm on my own, and I don't often have the radio on when I'm working anymore. I used to have it on, I needed that background noise. Now I'm happy with the quiet. And when I drop in and I go and work in clients' offices and I'm there for days or weeks, There is a little bit of an adjustment that it takes to
Yeah.
get used to it, but I'm pretty quick at getting into that now. But that's
Mhm.
taken years of work of, being able to concentrate and doing stuff when there's someone talking here, somebody eating there, somebody tapping on the keyboard next to you.
Yeah.
It takes a while.
Yeah, I know that only too well, and that's been a thing for me when I've worked with clients that, for example, have sort of open office landscapes.
Mhm.
And because what usually happens is they'll have the open sort of offices, and then they'll have 5, 6, 7, however many, like quiet office rooms or quiet call rooms or whatever they want to call it. And so, because, well, there are two things. One, I do like silence when I'm working, either that or music, but not sort of everyone bothering you all the time. The other thing, of course, is that if you're doing, especially business strategic stuff, there are cases or sort of times when maybe you don't want everyone else to know what you're working on, because what you're working can, of course, and will probably affect what they're doing. So you want to be left alone anyway. So the trick there, by the way, is to get in before everyone else to the client office, and then you sort of just sit down in that whatever office space the closed shut off one is, and then you just spend the rest of the day there, right? You'll become the asshole of the company quite quickly, I discovered. However, it is quite good for getting work done.
Yeah.
And if you're a consultant, you can take it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. You're not there to be popular, are you? You're only there for a limited period of time. So the other thing I find, if you're watching the video, you'll see what I'm holding up. If you're not, I've got the biggest pair of over-ear noise cancelling headphones I could find, because it's a great sign that just says "Leave me the hell alone" when you start using the big earphones on. So.
Yeah, yes, I know that all too well. It's another trick that I've used. I mean, I also have the noise cancelling headphones, the Bose ones, but just these headsets. You have it in your ears, but you don't have to have anything on. But it does sort of, force people to leave you alone, which is, good.
Yeah. We're not really antisocial people, but there are times when I just want to be left alone.
Yeah, but I mean, it's an interesting one, for strategists, because strategy for me is sort of a team effort, right? Especially if you're a consultant, because one of the problems I have with consultants is that they often take on this sort of, knight in shining armor kind of role, where you go in and you're supposed to have all the answers and you're going to do things my way and so on. Actually, most of the time, I think it was Tom Critchlow who put it like this. He said, really, if you're a consultant, you should play the Joker role, basically being sort of asking the stupid questions and sort of risking making a fool of yourself when other people will not sort of take that risk, because it'll usually get you to actually the sort of core problem and that kind of thing. But again, one of the problems, if you just sit there on your own and just sort of headphones on and just do the thing, is that if it's not balanced by continuous meetings and sort of updating people and so on, then it becomes, I suppose, both insulated and isolated from the reality of business sometimes, which can be problematic, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I'm just making a note to put a link to Tom Critchlow's consultancy blog in.
Yeah, it's very good, especially if you're a freelancer. It's excellent, his blog. I really like him.
So I know Tom's brother, Will.
Okay.
He ran Distilled, is now at Brain Labs, and I spoke at Search Love, their conference, so I know Will relatively well anyway. And Tom's blog is great. And I think just to wrap up what you were saying there about coming in with answers, another thing, as well as defining terminology, which is one of the things I tried to do early on, during the sales period, if you want to call it that, I make it as clear as I can that you're probably employing me to bring questions, not answers. Because often people want you to come in as the consultant with all the answers and the magic wand, but I lost my magic wand a number of years ago, so I don't have it to bring to engagements anymore. So I was like, I come with questions, because a lot of the answers you need probably in there anyway. 90% are in the organization. We just have a process to get that information out of people, and then we've got to make some decisions.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point, because I've spoken to agents especially about this. So brought up, through sort of basic to higher education and beyond, we're basically told that there's a correct answer, right? Every test, there's a correct answer. And if you don't know it, it's your fault. You should have collected more data and so on, studied more. Now, this creates a problem in complexity, because in complexity, there are no right answers, because it's no linear causality. A doesn't lead to B. And that's a bit of an issue if you work in strategy, because markets and firms and so on are complex adaptive systems. So you need to be able to manage that. And what often happens is that clients kind of expect you to know all the answers, exactly to your point. If you are a junior consultant, maybe you think you have all the answers because you've read all the books. That's also quite common. And what eventually happens, inevitably happens, I should say, is that you do the thing, and then it turns out that you were wrong, right? Something happened that you hadn't foreseen, or didn't have all the answers. And hello, imposter syndrome. But what is really important to understand is if you're dealing with complexity, and complexity is not a higher state of complicatedness, is an entirely different thing of entanglement, then A does not lead to B. And exactly to your point, the role of a consultant then is to ask those questions, being able to not go, well, I know what you're doing, what the answer is. You never do, because you won't know the business as well as your client anyway. But actually, what your job is most of the time is just go in and ask questions and sort of nudge people towards at least sort of providing you the answer. And then diversity becomes a really important thing, and so on, and diversity of thought and background and blah, blah, blah. But that's a different thing. But no, I completely agree. And I think, however, that is your conclusion is a senior conclusion, and it's not something that juniors necessarily know. Rather, they go in going, well, I've read how brands grow, hence, it's all like this or it's all like that. And you go, well, not necessarily.
Yeah, no, it's I think you get there through the hard-won mistakes, don't you? Sometimes as well. You've got to make a few mistakes to get there. So.
Yeah, and that's the thing as well. Like, just trying to learn from your mistakes is a big one, because we're all going to make mistakes. And God knows I've made mistakes too. But you learn and you go, and yeah, as long as you have that sort of, to use a cliche term, thirst for knowledge, but you're just trying to improve. That's the thing as well, is that when you talk about strategy or transformation or whatever, when you work with clients or companies, you're not looking to change things, you're looking to improve things. That's a big difference. And if you're just making small improvements every day, eventually you're going to get really, really good at stuff. And it's the same for yourself. I mean, again, you're just trying to improve every day, and that involves challenging not only sort of what people tell you, but also challenging yourself, and just keep on challenging yourself. And that's sort of, I have a newsletter which is called Strategy and Praxis. And that's largely about that. I'm just like trying to challenge myself and sort of industry doctrine, and at the same time. That's the only way to sort of actually get somewhere valuable, I think, overall. One problem I have with strategy discourse and marketing discourse at the moment is that we're quite good at sort of latching on to ideas without questioning them. And a lot of people don't realize that it's as sort of dangerous to dismiss an idea out of ignorance as it is to sort of believe in one out of the same sort of ignorance, just because you happen to like it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I think it's you've got to question everything, haven't you? That's even when it comes from somebody you trust, you like, and you think, okay, well, how does this fit? And it's probably something I've been wrestling with a little bit recently. I did Mark Ritson's
the mini MBA.
The mini MBA, and there was a couple of bits in that. Great course, really enjoyed it, and I would certainly recommend it to people if it's of interest to them. There was a few bits in there though where the process and the structure he described didn't, a lot of it matched with the process and the structure I used, but there were bits of it that actually completely contradicted it. And he sort of sent me back into that, right, okay, I need to get all this out. I've been using a similar process and improving it and tweaking it, but I've been using the same process for 5, 6 years, 7 years now. And I'm like, well, do I need to rip this whole section of it out and start again? And we go, so I'm going through that of the minute of going, well, do I question Mike Ritson and say I know better than him, or is that what I'm saying? And all these things are going through my head at the moment. So I've got a bit of time put aside in 2 or 3 weeks to sit down and just go, right, what am I going to do with this? To have those questions. But
that's a really good sort of way of approaching things. I like Mark. I disagree with him on a lot of points, but I like him as a strategist and a sort of thinker overall. But to take one example, right? So if we're talking about industry truths and dogma and challenging things, what about Bennett and Field's 60/40 rule? Now, I've written a lengthy critique of their work. It's not because I don't dismiss it. A lot of people take sort of criticism for dismissal, which is not the case. I really like both of them. But for example, this idea of as they talk about in effectiveness in context, that if your company happens to be defined, or you define the company as sort of being a part of a specific vertical, that means automatically that your ideal split is 62-38, for example, as it is in I think with fintech or tech companies, online companies, or whatever they use. And then you get into that problem that I mentioned before of sort of these context-free rules in a context-specific world. So you can start with that stuff. You can start with I mean, I really like the Erdmann Bass stuff. One, because it's based on evidence, and me being a former lawyer, I kind of like that. But also in every gig that I've done, I've sort of been able to replicate those findings. I've seen the same patterns. I've sort of seen the same rules work and so on. So it's just completely sort of replicable and repeatable. However, it's still always a starting point. It's this thing of, I mentioned my newsletter, which is called Strategy and Praxis. So it's not practice, it's praxis, which is theory-informed practice, which basically means you start with a theoretic point, you try it out, you learn and you adapt and think and that and the other. And at the end of the day, right, you can do one of two things. You can adapt your theory to sort of suit what you find in practice, or you can try to change practice to fit your theory. Now, one of them will probably work and the other one will probably not work, and I'll let you figure out which one it is. But that's true for regardless of what process you use, whether it's Mark or Lesson Peter or Sharp or whoever. It's just like it provides the starting point, and then you try to apply it to your business and what works for you and this, that, and the other. And, as much as I really like the EBI stuff and the patterns that I've seen all the time, I'm not saying that one day I'll see something that completely contradicts it. Who knows? There will always be exceptions to rules, but the rule is a good starting point.
Yeah, good starting point. Important, and I think there'll be links in the show notes to your newsletter, to the Edinburgh Bast Institute, and some of them. So if you haven't looked at the research that they churn out, please do. It's useful and like you say, a good starting point. But you've kind of touched on a couple of client projects and gigs that you've worked on. Can you bring one of them to life, or even one that was maybe particularly successful, or even one, I love talking about ones that were absolute catastrophic failures, and then the learnings from them as well. So it's not about let's highlight what you got wrong, but
right. So I'll give you one good and one bad then, or one success and one failure. Let's call it that. The success was when I first really took my new framework into practice. And I started trying to build this, and I did a global strategy for a big firm, and a global marketing strategy, I should say. And we started applying it directly, and this, that, and the other. And of course, even if you do the strategy, or if you're a part of doing the strategy, because it's always a team effort again, it's never down to you that the company did that, this, that, the other, but you're part of it. And we created quite literally billions of dollars in stock value in a year. I mean, it was really successful. So that was kind of cool. The other thing, the failure, and this is going back almost to the start when we launched the consultancy almost a decade ago. So we did a big rebrand thing for a company, or no, that's not true. We did a big rebrand, and the project was big for the company, but the company was like a medium-sized company. Anyway, and so in the rebrand, because it wasn't a sort of a question of all the bits being there and just sort of, defining the distinctive brass and so on. It was, they had done nothing. So we just needed to build something from scratch. So the rebrand was more of a create the band in the first place kind of thing. Anyway, so in this, we decided, or someone decided, actually we probably need a logo or something, because they didn't have one really. And then one of the designers working for the company said, well, why don't we make it a sort of a company-wide competition? So everyone can be a part of it. I went, naively, I went, yeah, sure. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea, democracy and so on, right? Right. So we have the thing. And of course, what happens is that almost the entire company put in they create logos. So that was good. The engagement was really, really good. The problem, of course, is that you can't please everyone, right? So what happened was, at the end of the day, you had basically 3 people who were sort of selected to have, the quote-unquote best logos. And then the rest of the company were just pissed off because their logos weren't selected, right? Then, of course, what happened next was we took those three logos to the board. and because they had to sort of, go with one of them. And then the head of sales went, actually, I want to be part of this as well. I haven't thrown my name into that. And we just went, okay. And so we basically told the CEO that, like, we don't think this is a good idea, but his word went, basically. So we just said, okay, fine. So he, of course, created his logo overnight, and it was shit because he was not a designer. It was just like, it looked like something a 5-year-old would do in paint, right? But because, of course, he was influential on the board, everyone just went, yeah, we'll run with that. So the end result was you had a bunch of employees that thought they were part of it being sort of run over by, the C-suite and the board, and the end result was complete crap. And that was one of those things where just like, yeah, in the future, maybe I'm going to play this slightly differently.
Yeah, the answer is let's pay an agency next time.
Yes, I mean, that was kind of the thing. But it was interesting working for this company because I learned a lot about agencies as well, because this was an ad tech company. And so they did a lot of programmatic stuff, because this is like one of the first things we did. So I had to study programmatic supply chain for 6 months before really doing any work with them, which is interesting when you start looking at the investment losses. And I analyzed 250,000 ads, and the average investment loss in total was something like 96 to 98%, even on premium sites, which is insane, but that's a different story. But anyway, so what happened was that so they would create these kinds of like ad formats, kind of thing, right? We could have this kind of ad or that kind of ad, or it can be still image, or it can be sort of interactive, this, that, the other. Okay, so what happens in practice then? Well, what happens in practice is that the brand or the advertiser, or the media agency, I should say, calls up this company and goes, hey, we'd like an ad. And the company goes, yes, we have 11 kind of different ad formats. And the client then goes, so which one is best? And then the ad tech company goes, well, they're all good, but we can create some mock-ups. And the client goes, oh, yes, that sounds good. Create some mock-ups for us. The ad tech company, which has no experience of design or anything like that, have quote-unquote business developers who use Photoshop. They put together like 3 or 4 different mock-ups, which is like taking the client logo and putting it on top of a sort of a stock photo, right? Mm-hmm. Presented to the client or the media agency, who then go, yeah, run with this instead of creative agency. I should actually do the job, because that will increase our ROI overall. And then people start complaining about how shit digital advertising is, and just go, well, yeah, it kind of is, you know what I mean? And so that was, things have changed a bit since then, because this is like a decade ago, but it's interesting when you sort of see those things firsthand, sort of, moving into the industry.
I always think that people have this outside vision of the marketing world, and obviously I think influenced a lot by, say, Mad Men and but also this, these genius marketers producing these campaigns that will change how people think and do this and I keep stumbling across stories like this where this is actually the reality of marketing. It's a lot of people making stuff up as they go along and trying to buy it for the cheapest price possible. That's what the marketing industry is in 90% of the time.
Exactly. But that's a very good way of tying it back to what I called naturalized strategy making. So if you look at advertising, right, especially when it comes to things like differentiation and purpose and those kind of things, it kind of presumes that customers or consumers are thinking actively about whatever you put in front of them, right? Now, and I'm going to steal a sort of an analogy from Dave Snowden here, but there are reasons why we only take in 3 to 5% of what's in front of us, right? Mm-hmm. So if you read the book, for example, The Invisible Gorilla, they ran tests with radiologists. So they showed them a bunch of X-rays, right? And in one of them, they had a picture of a gorilla, which was like 40 times the size of a cancer nodule. And 83% of radiologists did not see it, even though their eyes were physically scanning it. And what makes matters worse is that when they sort of the 17% that did see it, when they told the 83% after, they were sort of convinced that actually they were in the wrong. Now, there are reasons for this. So if you go back to, this is again something I've stolen from Dave Snowden, but if you go back to, the sort of the dawn of civilization and humanity, right? And you look at sort of the early humanoids on the sort of the belts of Africa, right? If you saw something big, orange with teeth running at you, right? what you probably didn't want to do would be to sort of look up sort of a best practice case study database of, you know, the flora and fauna of the African veldt, look up lion, and then sort of trying to deduce, okay, what to do in this scenario based on previous sort of experiences, because then probably the only book sort of value to you would be the Book of Jonah, which is, as far as I know and Dave knows, is sort of the only book that is about sort of escaping the inside of a big carnivore written by a survivor, right? So there is an evolutionary point to why we just scan 3 to 5% and then don't see the rest. And that's ultimately what advertising and brands are, right? They're like mental shortcuts.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important with distinctive brand assets, because again, people will only take away certain things in certain parts. And even if they're physically scanning something, they won't take all of it in. And so this idea of, well, if we just talk about it in, you know, nice enough terms or whatever, we'll be able to sort of convince everyone and persuade everyone. And that's just not how advertising works in practice based on science. Yeah.
Mike Follett's been on the podcast before. Again, I'm just making another note there. And his business is look at using eye tracking software to look at effectiveness of ads, Lumen Research, and some of the stuff Mike talks about in terms of, you know, it's like customers aren't looking for your ads. Nobody cares, right? And
no.
Once you understand that, it's better.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So customers aren't looking for your ads, and again, even if they're physically looking at it, doesn't mean that they take in the information. And that's interestingly enough, that's actually what autistic people do is they take in more information than sort of non-autistic people. And that's why they sort of end up in this sort of information / sensory overload. It's too much information to take in. So a non-autistic person will not take in more than 3 to 5% of what's in front of them, even if they're looking straight at it. And this has implications for advertising, one of them being get to the fucking point. You know, you can't have 3 minutes, because that's one of those things where, you know, you see winners at various award ceremonies and so on, where you have like 5 minutes of this big movie about emotional this, that, and the other, and just tack on the logo at the end. Like, no one will make the connection. But anyway, but that, again, that's another example of okay, so what does the science tell us about, you know, how we as human beings interpret information, for example, and how can we apply it to strategy and tactics and so on.
Yeah, and we're a funny species, aren't we? A very very strange one that behaves in predictably irrational ways, I suppose, is the best way to describe it.
Yes, and that's another thing as well. Is again, as I mentioned, you can sort of trace it all the way back to the 1700s. But a lot of economic theory, you know, going into like general competitive equilibrium and so on, it's based on this idea of rationality. And the reason why, as a side note, has to do with a guy called Paul Samuelson. He had to solve the utility problem. So what I mean by that is, like, so if you look at economic theory up until that point in history, we're now in like 1940s, 50s ish. Basically, it was based on this idea of utility. So a consumer or customer will only buy something that's useful to them. That's a sort of idea, which makes sense, right? But how can you measure the difference in, let's say, utility between an apple and orange? You know, are you going to mention, or is it measured in quote unquote utils? That's what they called it. You know, it depends on what you're trying to do. So Samuelson was a math guy from Harvard, and he basically said, well, okay, so screw that. We're going to just look at what people are doing instead, because we can't say what the difference in utility between an apple and orange is X, but what we can say is that this person prefers an orange to an apple, or vice versa. However, in order to make that work, he had to sort of assume that people were rational and consistent in their behavior. Otherwise, the mathematical formula didn't work. That's what led to eventually the sort of a Nobel Prize winning Deborah theory of general competitive equilibrium. But again, this idea of rational behavior. And although we can look at what people are doing, right, in and of itself, we also have to understand why people are doing it. And this idea that people are rational. I mean, if you ever listen to Rory Sutherland speak, and by the way, if you haven't, you need to go do that now, because he's amazing. But you do, exactly to your point, you do realize quite quickly on that people are not rational. They make sort of decisions based on recent memory and history and then context, and then they post-rationalize it, which is a completely different thing. Yeah. But that's also one of those things that when you realize that, a lot of traditional strategic doctrine just falls down, but that's a different thing.
The post-rationalization,
Mhm.
and I'm aware of the time, and this is quite a chunky subject to get into.
Mhm.
In terms of when you're researching or in the research phase of your
Yeah.
strategy projects, and I'm assuming I've made an assumption there that you have a research phase of your strategy
Yeah,
projects,
yeah,
but um, how do you view customer research? And I know in my view, there's so much terrible customer research out there,
yeah. Mm.
that it's almost useless in many cases. But you know, that post-rationalization of purchases and certain behaviors, how do you sort of unpick you know, decent research and find what's usable?
Um, there are a couple of things I think you need to, like baseline values, you want to call that you sort of want to keep in mind when going to any research project. So first of all, you need to keep in mind that whenever you do research, it will inherently, obviously, it has to be based on history. And if you're taking that to then make decisions and sort of conclusions about the future, you're kind of assuming that the future will bear a sort of strong resemblance to the past, which may or may not end up being the case. The other thing you need to really think about is, and this is also coming out of the EBI stuff, but if you go to research agency and ask them, for example, if you do a segmentation study, right, and you ask them to come up with a bunch of differences between all these segments, they will find the differences. However, they probably haven't looked at similarities. I mean, that's one of those room killers that I often do whenever I sort of in those situations where I go, well, has anyone looked at similarities? And they all go, no. And the thing is that usually when you look at similarities, you're probably going to find like 98 to 99% similarities between the various segments. Okay, then maybe we want to play the 99% as opposed to 1%. Stuff like that. So when you go into research stuff in terms of again, like the consumer behavior or customer behavior, whatever it might be, as opposed to the diagnostics about the company, what you're trying to find are patterns in behavior,
Mhm.
right? And trends. And you're trying to basically, in technical terms, you're trying to essentially move from equiprobability. In other words, you're trying to move from a situation in which every scenario, every outcome is equally likely. And that's strategy then becomes a matter of sort of improving the odds of success. That's another thing about strategy and complexity. You can never guarantee a result, but you can improve the odds of one. And the point about research is trying to figure out, roughly speaking, what the patterns are and the trends are in the market. And then again, using that as a starting point when you create the other stuff. Now, it will not be something, you won't be able to sort of draw a straight line from that point to the future because things will change and, you know, people change their behavior and so on. But again, it's a starting point. And one way that I've described because I know that not all people have read How Brands Grow, but I'll sort of explain what I mean by analogy really quickly. So traditional theory, especially coming from the US, because they haven't necessarily found sharp stuff yet, is that you find your best customers, right? The 20% that provides the 80% of the revenue, the traditional Pareto split and so on, and then you focus on that. That's what you're going to do. All right, so Jesus, my wife's going to kill me. It's 3 years ago now, almost. I've almost forgot how long it was since I got married, but it's 3 years ago now. So I got married, right? And so I was going on, well, I'm turning 41 now, so I'm going on 38 then. Up until that point in my life, I had never looked at wedding stuff, ever, right? I was a non-buyer of the category. The closer I got to the wedding, started about half a year out, I went from a non-buyer to a light buyer, and otherwise I bought some stuff, to medium buyer, I bought a bit more, to the heaviest of heavy buyers, because I was getting to the wedding, I bought fucking everything, right? And it, you know, costs you an arm and a leg as well, but that's a different thing. By the way, that's a sort of a tip if any of your listeners are getting married, try to do your own planning, because basically the idea of the wedding planner is like, it's like the consolidated loan bit. It's like all your different assholes you have to deal with, consolidated into one big, well, insert your word of choice here. But it will cost you an arm and leg and probably zero on what your budget was. Anyway, so yeah, so I buy more and more stuff. I get to the wedding, and then I'm now one of those, the people, the 20% we're going to focus all our efforts on, right? Then I get married, and the single best thing about being married is not having to plan a fucking wedding. So the last thing on the planet I want to see is now the ad for anything to do with weddings. I've gone from a 20% heavy buyer to, again, a non-buyer of the category.
Mm-hmm.
Yet for the next 3 months, I'm being targeted by wedding ads, which is completely useless because I won't buy anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're talking about this focus on the heavy buyer, the most profitable and so on, you kind of forget that people move in and out of these groups. And it's not necessarily your fault. One of the things lost in retention marketing is that people tend to forget that you may lose a customer, not of your doing, but because they're moving to a different city, get a new job, the parents may have died, whatever it might be, right? And so that is one of those things where, okay, so based on this and the patterns that we're seeing, we need to play broader and blah, 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 blah. But yeah, and that can come out of research.
I'm going to tell one painful story, not because there's anything you can do about it, but just you mentioned retention marketing, and it's currently the bane of my life.
Yeah.
I moved houses from somewhere where I had Sky TV to my current house where I can't have a Sky dish on the outside of the house. So I cancelled Sky and I've got Virgin in running my broadband. I get a phone call twice a week from Sky. I get a letter 3 times a month from Sky. Can come back. Here's an offer. Here's an offer. I'm like, no, I cannot physically have Sky TV where I am. Do you want to stop ringing me now? Yeah, okay. Phone rings again. Like, what point is it useful to your business to keep hammering me to try and get me to come back? Because even if I loved you more than life itself, I can't come back unless I change the planning law where I am.
Yeah,
and
no,
I
exactly.
do that. So.
Yeah, exactly. And there are 2 really important things here. So the first one is, rather than thinking in terms of retention marketing, think about just reacquisition. Because at the end of the day, if you talk about retention, it kind of presumes that there's a line where it goes from retention marketing to reacquisition marketing, or just acquisition marketing. And okay, so let's say you say, oh, well, based on customer lifetime value and so on, retention marketing is 2 years. Anything after that is, reacquisition. Okay, so what you're saying is that if a client has been with you or bought your stuff, rather, because it's never, you rent people in inverted commas, not obviously that, but you get my point. They're temporary buyers of you who also buy other stuff. And if you're not the largest, then they're probably going to buy more from others than you. But anyway, so what that means is that if a customer has quote unquote been with you for 1 year and 363 days, right? That's retention. And 1 day later, it's all of a sudden is reacquisition. You just go, huh? That doesn't really make sense. So making that distinction is a bit stupid, I think. Although, of course, you can do it in terms of, well, these are the client lists that we have in the database and so on. You're fine, but it becomes a bit of a theoretical thing that doesn't hold up in practice. The other thing is that, and this goes back to what I mentioned about starting point and trying to figure out what works for you and so on. But a really good trick, if you want to try to figure out this for your company, is to look at your growth rate and then your penetration rate and your churn rate, and then put them on the same diagram. Because what you're going to see then time and again, and it tends to be consistent to a point that you wouldn't believe, but what you're going to see is that your growth and your penetration are going to follow almost exactly to the point, whereas your churn is going to look like this. And it has nothing to do with growth. And those kinds of realizations, when you're doing the sort of the work, will not only will it sort of get you to understand your business, but also if you're speaking to, for example, a CMO or CEO, CFO, whatever, and you say, actually, we need to sort of work more with acquisition. Here's the evidence why. Then they tend to go, oh, actually, yeah, that makes sense.
I can see it. Yeah. Like it's one of the things I think I learned early on is that it's the power of a visual. You can talk around a subject for hours and ages. Sometimes you just need one chart on a wall, or somebody with a bad diagram with a pen on the wall, and they go, oh yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, exactly. And exactly to your point, do have the talk. A problem with a lot of companies that, and this is kind of unavoidable, but they become, of course, siloed. And the problem with marketers is that they think all sort of, finance people are dickheads, and vice versa, because they're not speaking to one another. However, if you actually sit down and speak, have lunch with people from the rest of your company. If you sit down and speak to the head of procurement, for example, he or she will probably be able to sort of give you all kinds of good advice about marketing and how you can ensure that marketing actually is, quote unquote, appreciated by the rest of the company and so on. And that's been also one of those things, and talking about sort of tricks and tips, but that's been consistent in my work is if you can explain marketing, and this goes back all the way to your first point about definition of language. If you can explain marketing in terms of language that finance people understand, all of a sudden your budgets will become bigger. So many problems just magically disappear overnight if you just start speaking their language. So instead of saying like brand building and activation, talk about it in terms of like stabilization of future cash flow and acceleration of current cash flow and so on. Speak their language, and all of a sudden, you'll be taken to be something completely different than you have been in the past.
Brilliant. Now, you've just dropped a top tip into the show there, and I didn't get to do the theme tune in advance, so I'm just going to do it post.
Yes, go ahead.
I really enjoyed doing the theme tune. So that was a TOPTIP. TOPTIP. There you go. The theme tune's the only bit of the podcast anyone ever mentions to me. No one ever says you had great guests or love that episode. I just people get messages going, why do you sing the theme tune? I'm like, because why not, eh? Why not?
Yeah.
So look, as the time is rolling on, so and you've mentioned a number of blogs, books, and resources and things. So what I've written down, I'm going to link to your Marketing Week columns, Tom Critchlow, your newsletter, Invisible Gorilla, Mike Follett. I think you mentioned General Competitive Equilibrium.
Yes.
Rory Sutherland, I'll link to that. But are there any other books or blogs or things that you can recommend for people?
I think if you're a marketer and you haven't read How Brands Grow, this is a popular theme, I think, from people like me who are evidence-based, but you need to read How Brands Grow 1 and 2. I can see them in your book. Yeah, I can see them in your bookshelf, the red and the blue. Yeah. But you need to read them because they are probably the most important books in marketing of the last, when they come up, 2000 and something. So let's say 30, 40 years at least. And so that's something that you really want to read. The other thing which is worth reading, although this is more of a difficult one, is a book called Strategist Synthesis by Bob DeWitt. So this is an MBA book for leaders. So it's not necessarily something that you want to read if you are a junior, although of course you can read it if you're junior, but it's not an easy read necessarily. But what I really like about that book is that it talks about all of these various tensions that we referenced. So the tensions between, for example, the global and local, but also the emergent and deliberate. And it will not tell you what to do. It's not a sort of recipe book, but it is a book that will kind of go, okay, so these are the various sort of views of strategy, and you need to be able to balance these because of that. So that's really good. And then the last one that I think is probably worth reading, especially if you're interested in sort of understanding how markets and firms work, is this book called The Origin of Wealth by Eric Beinhocker, who's one of the guys from the Santa Fe Institute. So it deals with complexity, but it's a really interesting book that kind of looks at economic history and what has got us to this point, and then it sort of explains and what we should do instead. But it explains a lot of things about how markets work and why, and the way that companies are run and why, and basically the problems with that you face every day, the kind of stuff that doesn't make sense to you, and the kind of discrepancies between the theoretic and the sort of the practical. It's a very good book for that, and also a very interesting read in general.
Good. No, and a couple of new ones there as well. I think How Brands Grow has turned up a couple of times in recommendations, inevitably because of its importance. But there, 2 new books. I'll
actually. Can I add a third one?
Yeah, of course.
This is one of those books that I probably deserve some sort of prize from the author, because I've sold him so many books on this. But there is a book called The Halo Effect by Phil Rosenzweig, and it's a really easy, quite entertaining read about strategy, but also especially about strategic analysis, and all of the different mistakes that you make as an analyst. The things about correlation versus causation, the fact that if you read books like The Lean Startup or From Good to Great, or I would argue that even Brett Field stuff is guilty of this, you can't really learn anything from only looking at companies that do well. And the way that I put this on Twitter is that, if you look at high-performing companies, you're probably going to find that they, for example, all have coffee machines. But your conclusion can therefore not be, well, that means that if you just buy a coffee machine, it means you're going to go on to be a successful company, because, of course, most unsuccessful companies have coffee machines too. And that's the thing about when you only look at high-performing companies and try to draw conclusions, you have no idea whether the poorly performing companies are doing the same thing. And the halo effect talks about that to a great effect. And it's one of those game-changing books, kind of like How Brands Grow. Once you've read it, it'll just completely change the way that you read, columns in Marketing Week or Harvard Business Review or whatever. It'll just change your worldview, and it's really, really cool.
I think that's brilliant. No, I'll have a look at that. And interesting, you mentioned, and I'm a fan of. Only jokingly anyway, I'm a fan of wild predictions of things that and declaring things dead, or companies that I don't think will be around at some point. So over the last year or so, I've confidently predicted, and I say confidently, that Netflix and Tesla will both not exist in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
Netflix, because I think they're fighting a battle with two people with deeper pockets, Disney and Amazon. So and something's got to give somewhere in there. And Tesla, because they were leaders and jumped forward. But if you look at the electric car sales now that the big boys have suddenly got into it, from Volkswagen Group and all, I think there's a lot of shake-up in the car market coming soon. And I tend to, the plucky startup, as sexy as it is, I just look at Volkswagen and go, they're going to win. And who else isn't? So my last prediction on this is, you mentioned about Coca-Cola. A company that seemed to do no wrong in a marketing angle for generation after generation after generation. From my very limited outside look, seems to have made a number of rather massive cock-ups in the last couple of years that suggest there's something deeper rooted wrong at the organization. Now, I'm not going to say they're going to disappear, but if you wanted to make a wild prediction of, could Pepsi ever overtake Coke? And that's the one where I'm going, if Coke keep making these missteps, maybe that's the wild prediction number 3 that I'm going to make.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. If you start with Netflix, I think you're right, but it becomes, I think it's a kind of a content war ultimately, because people, just like people would, I suppose, look at various channels that had whatever you want to see at that time on it. These days, people tend to just go, okay, so this new whatever channel this has this new show that I want to see, hence I'm going to look at that show there, and so on. But that's Tesla is an interesting one, because I think you've highlighted a couple of problems that most marketers don't see with Tesla. They just tend to think, oh, Tesla is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and Elon Musk and so on. Really, what happened with Tesla was that they were one of the first serious moves in the EV industry. And because of government grants and so on, it became really, really cheap to own a Tesla, especially if you're a company, because the price of running a Tesla is very, very little. And, again, you essentially be paid by the government to do so. So if you look at, I don't have all the figures, but I think in Northern Europe, at least, it's somewhere around 90-95% of all Teslas on the roads are actually company cars, not privately owned. And what has then happened is that, exactly to your point, is that the Germans have started to move in. And what do we see then? Well, all of a sudden, when you make this choice about running an EV, well, you can go with Tesla, which is, a nice looking car and so on, although I don't really rate the quality of it, but it's a different thing. It's very much built for Southern California, not for northern roads, let's say. All of a sudden you have Tesla, but also you have BMW and Mercedes and Volkswagen and so on. And you have all of these choices. And then, you start getting back into the Germans. So I think Tesla is probably sort of doing well enough to be, I think they'll be around in 10 years, but who knows? It's one of those things about people like me who are sort of complexity guys and I suppose girls, is that we never talk in absolutes, because we don't know what's going to happen. But who knows? But Coca-Cola is interesting because one of my sort of quote unquote famous, and lack of much better terms, points is that most companies, many companies, make it not because of their competencies, but despite their incompetencies, right? And so I think that's kind of true for Coca-Cola at the moment, is that although we see a sort of just the tiniest amount of what they put out there, but Coca-Cola is basically a distribution business, right? So they just need to get Coke into McDonald's and restaurants and so on. And I think, and this plays into the negative bottom distribution stuff, but about 50% of Coca-Cola's revenue come from people who buy one can every 2 years. right? That's how long the sort of light bars are. Now, the caveat there is I may have gotten that wrong, but basically that's what you're looking at. Even if you take a highly quote unquote differentiated brand like Dove, 80% of their revenue comes from people that buy one deodorant every 2 years or 3 years or whatever it was. There's a really good study by Charles Graham on this. But anyway, point being that unless the market screw up things like the product itself or the distribution, I think Coke will be around and they'll be decently fine. If they start, because the advertising stuff will remind people to buy Coke, yes, but really, again, it's about having it out there. I don't want wine. Well, then you're going to have Coke, basically, right? That kind of thing. And as long as they don't fuck that up, I think they'll be decently fine. But if they do mess with that, if they do go into this all agile, pivot everything all the time kind of thing, then I think we'll have a bit of an issue. And strategically over the last 5 years, they've been all over the place. So who knows?
Yeah. And I think that they're being hit, as everyone in that category is in what they call it, NABs, isn't it? No, whatever. In that European decline and sort of the move to healthier alternatives and getting a lot of corporate social responsibility stick for focusing on countries like Mexico, where average consumption is much higher. And almost, they're piling marketing efforts into there to try and increase that consumption because the socio background to it is not as negative to fizzy drinks as it is in the UK, for example. I appreciate that if you're sat at head office in Atlanta, there's a lot of challenges coming across your desk running a global business like Coke, as you say, distribution, changes in how people are behaving, and they've tried to get into sort of healthier drinks and things like that. And buying Costa Coffee, that is owned by Coke, isn't it, these days?
Maybe. I think they moved into that space. I think, haven't they moved into marijuana as well? I think, something like that. But you raise a couple of interesting points. And one of them, I think, especially concerning CSR, so corporate social responsibility. So one of them is, and this ties back to strategy. So when we talk about strategy and purpose and values and so on, it can very easily become neo-colonialist because a lot of the strategic theory comes out of white guys in the US and universities in the US as well, right? And although it may be that the world will be a better place if sort of it all lived by the values of people who go to Harvard. I'm not saying it wouldn't, but anyway, but basically a lot of that, well, we in our head office in Atlanta, exactly your point, we are going to define the values of everyone working for us in the entire world, and all of a sudden you're moving from sort of alignment to almost neo-colonialism. But the other thing that is interesting about purpose, and this is, so I'm not at all a believer in purpose for marketing purposes in the sense of sort of trying to convince people to buy your stuff because the evidence is just, it says something else. However, there is a point to purpose if you are relying on external investment. Because what we're seeing at the moment in investment in the financial industry is that a lot of investors will only invest into companies that are CSR driven for various reasons, which basically means that there might be a point to running purpose campaigns, even if it does fuck all for the consumers, of sort of signaling to potential investors that actually we are, CSR driven or whatever. And that's a point that's often lost in the sort of purpose debates. And now whether Coca-Cola needs that, I'm not really sure. But most of well, at least a lot of the supposedly purpose-driven companies like Unilever or whatever, if you actually look at their business as, to your point, it's just like, well, we're purpose-driven in this company, but actually we can sell some stuff in Mexico on the side, or,
There's a small number of companies who seem to live and breathe it from top to bottom, and they do it well, and purpose being tagged on to the side of something as a campaign, it makes my teeth itch. And in fact, I've been asked to contribute to a blog. In fact, it might be out by the time this comes out, but anyway, on moz.com about should marketers use purpose, and it's littered with lots of F words and S words saying, don't fucking do it unless you really mean it. So it's not a campaign, it's a business strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that is sort of often forgotten all this, and this is probably going to be quite a controversial point, especially if you happen to be religious, but within religion, there is this implicit idea of, if we don't define the commandments, for example, if we don't explicitly tell people that they cannot murder and rape, then people will basically do it, right? Which is kind of insulting if you look at the Jewish tradition, for example. And you know, I don't think the Jews would have made it all the way to Mount Sinai if they thought that murder, rape, and pillaging was sort of kosher, and then being told that it wasn't after all once they got there. But there's also this sort of almost, again, sort of insulting paternalistic idea of as long as we define the purpose for the company, you know, that's what ultimately leads our employees to be helpful or nice or whatever it is. And if we don't have that purpose, then people are just going to be dickheads to our customers, or they're going to sort of behave immorally, which I think is just stupid and again, kind of insulting. Now, again, you might have certain values that you want to define, sure, fine, whatever, but oftentimes the values that companies define tend to be, well, research says, I should say, that those companies do not live up to the values in the eyes of their employees anyway. So you may want to think about how you do that. But anyway,
let's talk about changing the world one coffee cup, one neighborhood at a time.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to end racism at Starbucks. Let's talk about racism while you're on the way to work. It's like, yeah, it's a bit of a bigger issue than that, my friend, but sure.
Well, listen, JP, if you can get me, if you have a contact at Mondelez who can come on and talk about their god-awful humaning thing, right? Yeah. I want someone on, and I've kind of approached a couple of people and they've gone, who I don't know, cold approach, and they've gone, no. So I want to talk, I want someone on and go, you do wonderful stuff, great. Tell me about humaning and what you mean by that.
Yeah, exactly. No, but it's just one of those things, like, if you want to do good because you want to do good, then by all means do good, right? If you want to do good because you think you can justify it through bigger returns or whatever, don't do it, because what it basically implicitly says is that you would do the opposite if it were better for business. Bad on purpose, if you want to call it that, which creates this sort of logical catch-22. And of course, the irony in that, if that's basically what companies do anyway, that's sort of tax and dodging and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, like, if you want to do good, then by all means do good, but don't do, quote unquote, do good under the presumption that it will change the world because, you know, or actually, no, they'll give you bigger profits so that your customers will care, because usually they won't. Yeah. So, yeah.
Good stuff. Well, listen, look, I have seen the time and I am going to have to let you go. But before I let you go, the last question everybody gets asked, what one question were you expecting me to ask that I haven't?
Probably what complexity is. I get that question a lot, but it is a big question. But I'll give you the very condensed answer. Yeah. So, and because it's kind of key to my view on strategy, right? So, I mentioned that firms and markets and companies are complex adaptive systems. So, complex adaptive systems are systems that are highly entangled and connected and intertwined. You have all of these various parts that interact and they create an emergent behavior, systemic behavior. Now, importantly, that behavior is different to the behavior of the parts. So a very sort of simple explanation of this is that if you were to go foraging or whatever, you see an ant and you look at the behavior of an ant, it won't tell you anything about the behavior of the colony, because the colony has its own behavior. Mm-hmm. Similarly, if you find a big colony, you can't reduce that behavior all the way down to an individual ant. Now, of course, human beings are a lot more complex than ants are, but the same principle applies. And what it means, for example, is that you cannot do root cause analysis. You cannot do the 5 whys. You cannot go, if we do A, then B will happen, because you won't know, because there's not that linearity. So understanding complexity as a sort of a complex system that is intertwined and entangled, is kind of like, what's that Alicia Barrera quote? It's like, what I call brickle bushes. Anyway, but like really entangled bushes, sort of, where you can, if you cut down one thing here, it won't lead to another thing there, blah, blah, blah. But everything is a really, really tightly connected and sort of coupled together. Understanding that when you do strategy basically means that, again, you cannot guarantee anything, but you can improve the odds, and you have to try, and you have to adapt, and you have to do this. And understanding complexity fundamentally changes your view of how you approach things, and it's a really important thing, because traditional strategic doctrine, especially the planning school, comes out of, and you can trace this, I have traced it in talks and so on, it comes out of really a Newtonian view of the world of everything being predictable and A leading to B, right? The problem is that research, or science, I should say, physics and so on, has moved on since then, and strategy hasn't. So we still think that markets are ordered, and if we do A, then B will happen, whereas science will be able to prove that that's actually demonstrably untrue. And so understanding complexity, and people like, Dave Snowden talks about this a bit, it'll just change everything. And that was a really shit explanation of complexity, but if you want a better explanation, you can just reach out to me on social media. So you can find me on Twitter. Yeah,
how do people find you? Twitter?
Twitter is probably the best one. I am on LinkedIn, but I detest it. So I'd rather put my eyes out with a spoon than be on LinkedIn if I can avoid it, because it's just amateur hour and done something. But Twitter at JP Castlin is the easiest way of reaching me. I'm there quite a bit, and then you can find me by my website as well, with jpcastlin.com. But if you have any questions, happy to answer them and engage. Again, that is a shit explanation of complexity. I can do a much better one, so just reach out and I'll give you the proper lowdown. Or of course, you can also find me via my newsletter, which is strategyandpractice.substack.com.
Brilliant stuff. So there's links to the newsletter, JP's website, Twitter feed, all in the show notes. Have a look, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening wherever. Click the link and get in touch. JP is a wonderful tweeter, and
thank you very much.
I enjoy it when I see them popping up on my feed. So listen, JP, this has been a wonderful kind of dance around all sorts of subjects, and thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure for having me, and it was amazing to be on. Thank you very much for having me.